is going to the way every company in America does business, and a complete reinvention of the American workplace is just around the corner. You might have some version of that tune for 20 years, maybe longer. What truth is there to it? Well, we all know that technological changes over the last 10 years have made it easier than ever for employees to keep in touch from outside of a traditional office, whether working from their homes, hotels, coffee shops, even on an airplane. There are some jobs that simply can't be done with being physically present in a traditional office or workplace. They're probably part of your job that you can do if you worked 100% remotely. And if you're following the news, you might have heard stories about big companies like Yahoo and Best Buy, which have either cut back on their telecommuting programs or gotten rid of them entirely. Full story. What is, the telecommuting can present tremendous advantage to employers and their employees, and most people who telecommute from a home office are very happy that they do. But for every job, and it doesn't fit for every employee, this area is still relatively new, or in some places it's totally untested, and there are significant challenges that come with managing a remote workforce. Again, from Ballard Spahr's Los Angeles office, my colleague Leslie Eaton and I are going to talk about what we see as the top legal and practical issues facing employers of telecommuters, set out what we see as some of the best practices on how to address those issues. In background, talk about the advantages and disadvantages of using remote workers. I'm just going to talk about how to put together a company-wide telecommuting policy and things to look for in selecting positions and candidates for remote work. Talk about issues relating to the location and the physical setup of an employee's home office. And today I say home office, I'm going to have an office that's actually in somebody's house. I talk about a physical workspace of the employer, I'm going to try and say main office. We'll also talk about some of the management challenges that come with monitoring employees work remotely, both in terms of legal challenges like watching out for potential wage and hour issues, and also interpersonal challenges, like to address possible feelings of isolation that can lead to an employee bringing out. Finally, we're going to wrap up by talking about how to draft a telecommuting agreement to a specific employee. Throughout the presentation, we welcome you to submit questions through the Q&A box. We'll be able to address many of them during the presentation. We'll make an effort to if we can, but to the extent that we can't, we will follow up on the questions that are submitted the Q&A box via email later on. We've circulated copies of the slides in advance, I understand, and we're going to be again sending out a copy of the slides after the show. So what are we talking about when we talk about telecommuting? To start and lay some ground rules, I wanted to give a quick definition, and here's one that I thought makes sense. Telecommuting is a practice in which an employee works at a location, on his or her home, that is from the actual business facility at which he or she is employed. Under this arrangement, the employee maintains close contact with coworkers and supervisors via various forms of computer, internet, and communication technology. Talking about just how common is it? Statistics put together by an organization that monitors this stuff, the Telework Research Network, and another one, World at Work. A little over 50% of the employers in the U.S. currently offer regular telecommuting arrangements to at least some of their employees. And many as 17% of employees in the U.S. telecommute either entirely or as a part of their work week. As of 2011, only about 2.3% of the U.S. workforce, or about 3 million people, considered home to be their primary place of work. So what we see is that a lot of people are telecommuting, but they're not working from home every day. On average, it looks like telecommuters are working about half their time from home, about 2.5 days a week. As you would expect, have been increasing. Between 2005 and 2010, the number of workers who worked at least 1 day a week from home increased about 18%. Typical telecommuter. Well, relative to the total population of U.S. workers, a disproportionate share of management, professional, sales, and office workers telecommute. It looks like the split is roughly even, though slightly more men than women telecommute. Telecommuters tend to be older, better educated than the average worker. The typical telecommmuter, according to the Telework Research Network, is 49 years old, college educated, salaried, non-union employee in a management or professional role, earning $50,000 a year at a company with more than 100 employees. Increases in the number of government workers that telecommute at the state level and especially at the federal government level. In 2010, in an effort to government spending, President Obama signed off on a law called the Telework Enhancement Act of 2010. Most of you in the audience today don't represent government employers. You represent private employers who aren't going to be the subject of this law. But it makes sense for us to look at it for a minute to the extent that it might shape what courts are going to expect when they look at private companies' telework arrangements. Under the federal law, all agencies are required to put together a policy under which eligible employees can work from home. It has to determine eligibility criteria for all of its employees who participate in that program. And any federal employee who wants to work remotely is going to have to enter into a written telework agreement. He is going to be required to work from home under this statute, but once they agree to do so, they will be required to work under the terms of their telework agreement, which could mean, for instance, if they have to work hours that are outside of their regular 9-to-5 working hours that they'd be working in the office. And it requires that agencies provide telework training that will be completed prior to a worker signing a telework agreement. The Office of Personnel Management has issued a memo talking about how federal employees may be permitted unscheduled telework in emergency situations. So let's look at some advantages and disadvantages of using a remote workforce. In a nutshell, employees who telecommute tend to be, on average, happier and more productive. I think that's the kind of employees that we all like working with and we all like managing. So that's generally what people point to as the best single advantage. But some others are listed here. Teleworking can save money on overhead in certain situations, especially if you have arrangements set up where you're using less actual office space at the employer's facility. There's a huge potential savings there. Telecommuting has been seen to lower the rate of absenteeism. For example, suppose you've got an employee who lives an hour away from the office, a doctor's appointment, and the doctor's appointment is going to take about 2 hours. If they're going to work, that 2-hour doctor's appointment could turn into a 4 hours away from work, and they might find it's just easier to simply take the whole day off, call in sick, rather than have to drive to and from work twice. Whereas if the employee is working from home, the 2-hour errand is just a 2-hour errand, and they have a productive work day other than that. You noted that telework arrangements can improve the continuity of operations. So you might have a situation where someone is returning from an illness or an injury and isn't ready to commit to a full-time workday in the office, but they can continue to on calls, return emails, do some work from home. So it can be used kind of as a ramp up. It's been said to enhance productivity, and that is especially true, the studies have shown, for people that don't work from home every single day, but people who might work from home a couple of times a week are able to take that time, lock in on their tasks, and be particularly productive. Also seen that companies who offer telecommuting have an advantage in recruiting employees. So not everybody wants to work from home themselves, but almost everyone likes to know that their employer is at least offering that option. So it's a great thing to be able to say to potential employees that you offer telecommute arrangements. So remote workers generally tend to report higher job satisfaction than people who are working in a traditional office setup. Let's talk about the possible disadvantages or concerns. Well, frankly, it can be difficult to supervise people who are working remotely. And we're going to talk today about a lot of strategies that we recommend in terms of best ways to manage people remotely. But the truth is it can be difficult in certain circumstances. Others have complained about possible concerns over a change in corporate or organizational culture. Some have said that it can result in a certain loss of a sense of community if a lot of employees are working from home. This is something that we saw touched on a little bit in the Yahoo situation. Some of you might have been following the news story last spring. Yahoo's new CEO, Marissa Mayer, decision to drastically cut back on work-from-home arrangements at Yahoo. They sent a memorandum around, and here's the relevant language that Yahoo gave in terms of why they were making the decision. They said, to become the absolute best place to work, communication and collaboration will be important. We need to be working side by side. That's why it's critical that we are all present in our offices. Some of the decisions and insights come from hallway and cafeteria discussions, meeting new people, and impromptu team meetings. Speed and quality are often sacrificed when we work from home. We need one Yahoo, and that starts with physically being together. There was a shift at Best Buy, although their shift was less radical than Yahoo's was. Best Buy isn't eliminating their work-from-home arrangements altogether, but previously they had a particularly liberal work-from-home arrangement where certain designated employees could work from home even if they didn't have a supervisor's or manager's permission to do so. And so they changed the program to require that only employees who have managerial approval can work from home. So another concern that people have talked about, and this is reflected somewhat in the Yahoo memo, is that employees working from home present fewer opportunities for team synergy. So we'll see, in particular, where people's jobs require them to engage in collaborative work and collaborative problem-solving type things. It may make more sense for those people to spend more time in the office than to work remotely. Some also mentioned concerns regarding startup costs, the costs of outfitting employees who are working from home with necessary equipment and so forth will require an investment up front in certain cases, and some people have been a little bit hesitant to jump into telework arrangements for that reason. Now, we talked earlier about increased productivity, but the dark side of an increase in productivity people is going to be a risk of burnout. When you're working in an office, you have the obvious social cues of it's getting dark and people are starting to go home. People are leaving. That's not obvious when you're working from your home office. It's pretty common that people working at home offices might work significantly longer hours. And so we need to watch out for the possibility that people might get burned on their work. All people have mentioned the possibility that remote workers might miss out on certain advancement opportunities because not having the face-to-face contact with other folks that they work with as much. And so that's something that we need to be cognizant of. At this point, I'd like to turn over to Leslie Eaton, who's going to talk a little bit about drafting a telecommuting policy.
This is Leslie Eaton. I am resident in Ballard Spahr's Denver, Colorado office. With respect to telecommuting policies, our recommendation is, our best practice recommendation is that the companies adopt a written global policy that is published to all employees that sets out the general ground rules, and then that the company also enter into a separate telecommuting agreement with each telecommuting worker. So I'm going to talk about the types of things that might be included in the more general, high-level telecommuting policy that the company adopts. First, you might want to include specific definitions. This is where the company can set out what does telecommuting mean to your organization. You want to define home office workers as workers who spend a certain amount of hours working from their home office. You may also want to set out a separate definition for mixed workers, which would be, for example, the typical telecommuting worker that works perhaps 2.5 days a week from home, but not every day from home. Next, you should include an explanation of your commitment to telecommuting and general principles. For here, you might want to include some language that telecommuting, the company recognizes is important and can be helpful. I would include language indicating that from the company's perspective, telecommuting is a privilege rather than a right. So you may want to include other general principles such as a policy specifying that telecommuting is not being offered so that employees can avoid paying for child care. Next point to stress in a policy is that the telecommuting arrangement is voluntary, and this is voluntary for both sides, both the employer and the employee. The next item, and one of the most important items to include, would be selection criteria. This is where you get a chance to lay out your objective, non-discriminatory criteria for selecting who will be allowed to telecommunicate. And you may want to consider various things, like indicating that somebody has to have a specific number of years of service, maybe 2 years of service, that the telecommuter has to have had a history of good performance evaluations, low absenteeism. You might want to set out here who would be involved in making the decision to allow someone to telecommute. And these, I mean, obviously, whenever you can set out objective, non-discriminatory criteria, that's an important background to have in the event of claims that come in the future. Also need to make sure that your selection criteria are consistently applied, because any court looking at a claim where one worker might be claiming discrimination because they were not permitted to telecommute, the courts are certainly going to compare the circumstances of employees that were permitted to telecommute with the circumstances of employees who were not permitted to telecommute. The next thing to include in a policy would be a performance evaluation. How is the organization going to measure performance of the telecommuter? Timekeeping arrangements are important. Any policy should require telecommuters, especially non-exempt telecommuters, to keep accurate timekeeping, have specific procedures for timekeeping, and policy should specify that no overtime should be allowed without prior approval for non-exempt employees. A policy should also indicate that the company would have a right to inspect the home office of a telecommuter, obviously giving the telecommuter sufficient notice and at a mutually agreed upon time. The policy could lay out expectations with respect to the telecommuter attending at the main office. It could lay out that there are regular meetings that should be attended in person. That could be included in the policy. The policy could also say something like meetings in the main office as necessary, and about who will determine whether or not the meetings at the main office are necessary. A very important item to include in the policy is a statement that telecommuting decision is the sole discretion of the employer. So the employer has sole discretion to decide to allow telecommuting in the first place, continue a telecommuting relationship, and the employer maintains sole discretion to terminate the telecommuting arrangement. John already mentioned the issues with Yahoo and Best Buy, and in those positions, the employer had to maintain the right and sole discretion to decide to terminate. They had that discretion. Did end up with some very unhappy employees, but had the right to terminate. So including that statement in the policy is very important. And if the relationship is going to be terminated, there should be included a process for terminating that arrangement. I mean, in other words, is there a minimum notice period to terminate? The policy should set out that there are reimbursement policies. We'll go into that a little bit more detail when we're talking about specific agreements. The policy should reiterate that all of the organization's privacy and confidentiality policies will apply. we think it's best practice not to let new hires be eligible for telecommuting. That's because, first, I don't have a track record with them. You don't know if they're going to be, reliable telecommuting workers. And the thing is that if you allow a new hire to be eligible, this can sort of morph into a situation where somebody could start to use it as the basis of an argument that it was part of their job offer was the ability to telecommunicate or telecommute. So, if somebody decides to allow remote work, how do you decide who can do it? The first thing to look at is the work to be performed well suited to remote work? And John's already talked about some of the jobs that would not be well suited. Jobs that involve people needing to meet face-to-face, jobs that require people to have a lot of collaboration. And a really great place to start is to just go to the job description and make a common sense decision. For example, is it a job that requires someone to have immediate access to records or equipment or materials that are located only at the main office? In that case, it probably does not make sense for that person to telecommute. The thing to look at is candidate well suited to remote work? Generally, the most successful telecommuters are self-starters, people who work well with limited or no supervision, people who have a record of strong performance, people organized, and importantly, people who actually are tech savvy. And I mean, they are not just who's able to send and receive emails, but someone who has a little bit more technological savvy and might be able to back up information on a database if necessary and do some limited troubleshooting with respect to computer equipment if they run into problems. There's no requirement that only exempt workers should be permitted to work remotely. There are risks, which I mentioned before, about having hourly workers work off-site. The biggest risk is the need for reliable timekeeping procedures, requiring hourly workers to keep accurate timekeeping, having procedure whereby the employer can track the time worked by hourly workers, could potentially be log in or log out from your computer, call to supervisor. Of course, you would need a policy that no overtime is allowed without authorization. And it's important, especially with hourly workers, that the company make sure that these specific procedures are in place and that they are enforced. We're selecting employees for remote work. You watch out for the possibility that your selection criteria result in potentially discriminatory practice. In other words, if you have a high proportion of people being permitted to work remotely that are women with young children and don't have any other objective criteria for making those selections, you get into a situation where you get complaints from males or from people who don't have children. Consider objective performance standards, as I mentioned before. Objective selection criteria could time of service, performance levels, record of absenteeism, that type of thing. It's important to document reasons and document your objective, non-discriminatory reasons for your decisions to or not to allow telecommuting at particular candidates. Again, I'll mention that if somebody brings a claim based on turned down for telecommuting, the courts will certainly be able to compare the circumstances and reasons that the company chose to allow one worker to telecommute and not allow another one. If attendance record is going to be one of your selection criteria, just keep in mind that there be absences from an alleged disability, and just kind of be mindful of that as you make your selections based on attendance policies. Speaking of the Americans with Disabilities Act, the next thing to think about is can from home arrangements constitute a reasonable accommodation that an employer is required to provide under the ADA. So the Americans with Disability Act requires employers to provide reasonable accommodation to qualified individuals with a disability. And you might know the definition of disability has recently been expanded exponentially. So is work from home a reasonable accommodation an employer is obligated to provide? Very little guidance on this. The OSHA guidance says not all persons with disabilities need or want to work from home, and not all jobs can be performed at home. Allowing an employee to work at home may be a reasonable accommodation if a person's disability prevents successfully performing a job on-site. Job or parts of the job can be performed at home without causing significant difficulty or expense. So you get any specific guidance. And to date, most of the courts that have looked at this issue have agreed with lawyers who take the position that work from home arrangement is not a reasonable accommodation that employers would be required to provide because essential work tasks require face-to-face on-site presence. The most commonly cited case finding that telecommuting is not a reasonable accommodation that must be offered. It was a decision that dates back to 1995. So more recently, the tide seems to be turning. For example, in the recent years, the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, while not directly issue an opinion that work from home is required as a reasonable accommodation, has issued several opinions that recognize the concept that working from home can be a reasonable accommodation in an ADA situation. And as technology continues to advance and ability to meet by teleconference, Skype, email, etc., becomes easier and easier, we could be looking at a change of a change of perspective with respect to whether or not an employee in some situation, an employer, in some situations might be required to offer working at home as an accommodation for a disability. I will turn it back to John, who will talk about locations and home offices.
So in some cases, we have remote workers who, are going into the office some days. Some days they're just working from their home office in the same town as their main office. But you also have some employees who are working in a remote part of the state or even in another state. So it's important to be cognizant of issues that might result from the location of the worker relative to their main office. So we want to think about cross-border issues, mostly in terms of state law, but also sometimes in terms of laws applicable to a particular city and even zoning type violations that might depend on particular areas within a city. So you want to look at whether there are potential unemployment tax obligations that would arise out of an employee working from a different location. Think about whether there are income tax obligations relative to what state they're working in. And some states will be particularly aggressive in trying to claim tax obligations for the work that is performed by someone who is a remote worker doing a little bit of work in that state. For instance, there's a fairly recent case out of New York talking about an employee who lived in Tennessee and was in the New York office 25% of the time. The New York court found that that employee was a New York employee and was obligated to pay New York state income tax on 100% of their income. Also, one thing that we want to think about is whether there are different state laws that would apply with respect to restrictive covenant issues, covenants not to compete. For instance, you may be in a state where covenants not to compete are totally valid. An employee had been working in your state, signed an agreement like that, and they're going to start working out of a home office in California. where agreements like that are not valid. We want to be up to date on what the laws are of the relevant jurisdictions in terms of the applicability of those kinds of agreements. Also, we want to think about would this employee working in a different state or jurisdiction have an impact with regard to state anti-discrimination laws. For instance, if you have an employee who might potentially bring a sexual orientation claim, but in a state where that's not by the state law, it's not prohibited by the federal law, and the employee moves to California or some other state which recognizes that as a cause of action. Think about whether that is going to, trigger potential liability and accord yourself in line with that. Also, and we'll talk about this in more detail later, there's real potential risk of wage and hour issues if an employee is moving from one state to another. We want to think a little bit about zoning issues. It's really unlikely that a zoning issue is going to come up just in the context of someone simply working out of their own home office if they're just working on their laptop and talking on the phone. But you may have situations where you're supervising employees who are doing more sensitive work at home that might require, for instance, their use of certain chemicals or certain equipment that would run afoul of particular zoning laws, and you want to be make sure that you're covered on that. Also, take a look at your workers' compensation insurance policy in the sense of whether that would apply to employees in all of the states where you have teleworkers. Another you might ask is, how does a remote worker's home office location impact his or her eligibility under the MLA? Well, somewhat surprisingly, the Department of Labor has taken the position that it doesn't really make a difference. As you may recall, FMLA eligibility requires that an employee work at a location where the company employs 50 or more employees within 75 miles. So you would have an employee who's within that 75-mile window and then starts working from a home office that's outside of that radius. According to the DOL's regulations, employees who work at home under the concept of what they call flexi-place, same thing as what we're calling telecommuting, are deployed at the work site to which they report and from which assignments are made. And the employee's residence is not a work site. Okay, an employer has responsibilities for making sure that the workplace is safe. But let's talk about how that has been interpreted to apply to a home office. Leslie mentioned earlier when she was talking about company policies, she suggests that the company should make it clear it has a right of access and it may conduct routine inspections to ensure that the workplace is safe. So some might wonder, is there a risk that OSHA is going to come knocking on the door of an employee who's working out of their house? And the answer is only not. Thank goodness. Back in 2000, OSHA put out a memorandum which indicated that they would be conducting inspections of home offices. Frankly, everybody flipped from the public to Congress. Just unanimously, people thought that this seemed like government overreaching. And very shortly thereafter, OSHA reversed its position as that they would not be conducting inspections of home offices. There is a very limited carve-out for what OSHA calls home-based work sites, which would not include typical home office situations, but would include the kind of thing I was discussing a minute ago, where an employee might be doing work with hazardous chemicals or something like that at their home. And even under those circumstances, OSHA is not going to be conducting random inspections as far as we know, but would only be acting in response to specific complaints. OSHA isn't going to be knocking on the door of employees' home offices doesn't mean that the employer is necessarily off the hook. And it can still be liable for injuries to employees working from home, and the best practice is going to be to take steps to reduce the likelihood that that's going to happen. And to that end, we do recommend that employers conduct off-site inspections of employee home office. The checklist that we've put together that you could use if you are visiting and inspecting an employee's home office. Generally, the things that you want to look for would answer these kinds of questions. Does the employee have everything they need to do the job? Is it safe? Do we trust our property, our IP here in this person's home? And also just to generally be on the lookout if there's any reason to believe that there are things that suggest this might not be a good idea. And many of these may be problems that are correctable. Some of them might not be. So you want to does this employee have the tools and the technology that they need to do the job? And this is going to depend on specifically what you need for your business, but typical things that you might look for is, does this employee have a computer, a cell phone, landline, fax machine, scanner? Do they have kind of video conferencing set up? Also, do they have sufficient technology to back up data so that it's not backed up automatically? Is their office setup ergonomically correct? Are there obvious distractions that you see? Things like other adults or kids who are at home during the day. Are there a bunch of pets? The environment in some way not conducive, possibly by noise or something else, to getting work done. For the kinds of things also that you would just look for if you were inspecting new office space for a main office. Is there smoke detectors or adequate ventilation? Can people move easily more than one way out of the work area if there's a fire? Is there wiring? And so forth. Also want to think about, is there adequate security? And this would mean, security for their home in general. All things like, to the extent there are physical files of the company that will be maintained there. There are locks for those. Similarly, is there adequate security in the tech realm? If they're working off of a network, home Wi-Fi network, is the home Wi-Fi network sufficiently password protected? Are there adequate protections for the company's IP that they might have access to? Is there an automatic data backup system? If not, talk to the employee. Make sure that you have a plan, because nobody wants to be in a position where the employee's working on something remotely, they have a laptop in a coffee shop, and it's just gone. Now, we recognize that it might not be feasible in every case for somebody from the company to get out there and physically inspect an employee's home office. And I think it makes a lot of sense to ask that the employee take a photograph of their workspace, send it into the company, and that can just be maintained in the file along with their telecommuting agreement. And that's a good practice whether you can get out there and do a physical inspection or whether you can't, because God forbid you have a situation where an employee is injured, which we'll talk about in a minute. It'd be good very quickly for somebody who's evaluating that to have photographs of what the workspace looks like so they can have a sense of what was going on when an accident occurred. Reiterate, the policy should be clear that employees don't have an expectation of privacy with respect to devices that they can connect to a company network or use to perform company work. Employees, and policies like that are generally already in employee handbooks that would apply to laptops or desktop computers at work. Employees who are working from home often might be using their own home computers to log on to the network. And it should be made clear that once they're on the company network and they're using a device for that purpose, the company has the right to inspect the device. Also, the ADA might require special equipment to some extent for employees who are working from home. For instance, wrist rests for employees who are typing, or orthopedic chairs, similar to what they would require for employees who are working in a regular home office. But remember, just as with employees who are working in a regular main office, but there's always going to be a balancing type test where they'll look at the burden to the employer. So it's unlikely that the ADA would require an employer of an employee working from a home office to build, for instance, a wheelchair ramp to make other major architectural changes. Another thing to consider is potential liability for injuries, not just to the employee, but to, for instance, business members, business visitors who might be at their home office or family members. So you want to look at your workers' compensation policy, get a sense of whether that would be covered. Workers' comp statutes generally cover injuries regardless of whether they occur on the employer's premises. In the context of employees who work from home, frankly, work-related has been interpreted too broadly. We haven't been too heavy on the case law in this presentation. I'm going to talk to you about 3 decisions really quick so you can get a sense of the way this trend works. The first case I'm going to talk about is called Renner versus AT&T. This is a New Jersey case from 2011. As an employee who was working from home on her computer, and she was working up all night on a project that had a tight deadline. This day, at this point, she is no longer working. She was taking her kid to school. She developed a pulmonary embolism due to a blood clot in her leg, and she died. In that case, the court credited evidence that the embolism resulted from extended periods of inactivity, and specifically, it found likely that they resulted from the extended periods where she was sitting at her computer working, and the inactivity that she had there was a lot greater than the inactivity that she had when she wasn't working. Some of that injury was work-related and therefore compensable. In another case from Oregon in 2011, this case is Sandberg versus J.C. Penney. An employee who worked for J.C. Penney is an interior decorator. So a lot of her time would be spent going out to customers' homes to look at their spaces. She might work from her own home office, putting together potential designs or budgeting type work. When she was walking from her home studio to a garage to pick up a work sample, and she tripped over her own dog. This found to be a work-related injury, and it was found to be compensable. The court looked at it and said, well, the employer had control over where she worked, so the employer could have made a decision so that there wouldn't have been any dogs around. The employer didn't do that, and therefore this is work-related. Third case is E. Clevitt versus Labor Commissioner. This is from Utah in 2000. An employee who was working from home, he was salting his driveway on an icy day, and he slipped and fell. That was found to be work-related. And the reasoning behind it, and the employee's explanation was, well, I saw the mailman coming down the street, and thought the mailman might have a package for me related to work. Even that was enough to say that work-related and therefore compensable. So what we're seeing here is that really there is a risk that courts are going to stretch the meaning of what it means to be work-related in context, and so there needs to be vigilant. Again, that's one of the reasons that we're recommending that you take a look at the employee's home office to see whether you can point out any potential hazards. Also, it makes sense in drafting the individual agreement, which Leslie will talk about in a bit, to the extent that you want to put any particular restrictions or define things like work areas, e.g., you are not to work, in your backyard by the swimming pool. You are to work in the home office that you designated to the company, that sort of a thing. To potential gray area issues where someone conceivably could have been working but more likely wasn't. Generally requires as part of the policy that people report any alleged injuries really promptly so that the company has the ability to make a prompt investigation. And I'm going to turn to Leslie, who can talk a little bit about some of our practical ideas for monitoring and managing remote workers.
John, I'm going to take a break from addressing the straight legal issues and want to talk for a few minutes about some challenges from a personnel and management perspective for monitoring and managing telecommuters. one of the most important things is that everybody have an understanding that it's really important for people in the main office and people in the home office to stay connected. Should be a big, clear understanding of expectations, including expectations about the frequency of how often the home office worker is going to check in with the main office, with a supervisor or someone else. Clear managers and supervisors of workers who are telecommuting play a key role in this. So does technology, the ability to email, to instant message, to teleconference, and to Skype. All of those things do help the home office workers stay connected. And John discussed earlier, and the home office workers do face risks of isolation and feel like they might be inadvertently excluded from regular happenings at the office. Sometimes might feel like they get passed over for opportunities because they're not around and visible. They might feel like they might get passed over for the best events and projects, or passed over for promotions. And sometimes this is referred to as the stepchild syndrome, where the main office workers, if they are always having personal meetings, for example, and the home office worker or one or several home office workers have to dial into these in-person meetings attended by most of the people at the main office, they just may start feeling like second-class citizens. So important to consider ways to make regular contact with telecommuters. I'm inviting them to participate in regular main office meetings or social gatherings is a good idea. Be as inclusive as possible. Try to be mindful of, for example, something so easy as the fact that maybe some home office workers are in a different time zone. That happens here at our own firm. And, when people in the East Coast finally figure out that people on the West Coast, it's kind of difficult to show up for meetings at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning. It did a lot to scheduling meetings at times, keeping in mind of times that everyone could attend. That did a lot to help with our firm cohesion. And another idea is because home office workers so often are, dialing into a meeting by phone, is maybe have some meetings that are all done by telephone. So everyone dials in, so there's sort of less of a main office versus isolated home worker sense. Enough about people's feelings. Back to the law. So the next thing that we have touched on this, but it's very important that we do so again because this is key and an area that's fraught with peril. Non-exempt employee challenges with respect to timekeeping. This is something that we really do have to pay attention to. Interesting because very often sort of the initial knee-jerk reaction to management about workers who want to work at home is that workers will be more likely to slack off if they're at home. But as it turns out, the bigger concern for employers is exactly the opposite. The most common claims of remote workers are for unpaid time worked off the clock. So, the FLSA doesn't make any exemptions for employees who work remotely. There is a very big risk of liability for unapproved overtime, even if you've got company rules and policies that forbid overtime without permission. From the perspective of the courts and the departments of labor, the burden is always on the employer to show that the hourly employee did not work overtime. So we need to watch out. One thing to really watch out for is emails or texts or any kind of communications between non-exempt workers and their supervisors or managers outside of regular working hours. The employer will always be deemed to be on notice that the non-exempt employee was emailing, texting, or otherwise communicating with a worker or manager during off hours, and then they will take the position that the worker should be compensated for that. So one way to monitor, especially exempt employees, is to consider requiring, if they're working on their computer, for the most part, required to log in and log off. I mean, almost as a replacement for punching a time card, a time clock. And you may also want them to log off during meal periods if meal periods are required for non-exempt workers under state law. More cumbersome is to have the non-exempt workers dial in and let their supervisors know when they're logging on, or when they're starting work, and when they're ending work, and for meal periods. But as I said, that's probably more cumbersome than some kind of log in, log off. And so again, to the time, log in, log off is probably the easiest. And there's also some time management softwares out there that could be helpful for tracking the time. Very important that they continually stress to employees they are required to have a reliable and accurate timekeeping, and important to enforce that. Also important to enforce the no overtime without prior approval rules. Those are the things that are easy to start slipping, and you can just get into a slippery slope position. When thinking about travel time, the cases and the suggestions from the agencies are that routine visits to the main office from home office workers are probably not compensable. And then, although beyond the scope of this particular presentation, if there are risks if companies start using or thinking of home office workers versus main office workers, and the difference as perhaps supporting an independent contractor status for home office workers. Important to keep in mind that working from home is not one of the factors that's considered in determining independent contractor status. The key factor is and remains who is directing and controlling the worker in performance of the services. Another thing to be mindful of is that whether or not to allow telecommuting workers is people who have alcohol or substance abuse issues may be attracted to a home office work situation because, frankly, it helps to cover up their condition. So important to reiterate that drug and alcohol policies still apply even when someone's in the home office. Commuters should be subject to the same drug and alcohol testing procedures as the rest of the workforce, if such testing procedures are in place. And definitely drug and alcohol-free workplace policies should be reiterated to home workers. Obviously, the challenge is enforcement of, but something to be mindful of. We mentioned earlier that it's repeating early and often to employees that they clearly need to understand that there are limitations on their privacy, even in a home office setting. For some reason, employees just naturally assume that because working from home, perhaps because they're using some of their own equipment technology, they have some greater rights to privacy because of those circumstances. But the company is in a position where it will need to protect its information and its property, and therefore the company has the right to monitor employees and to remind employees that they don't have any greater privacy rights. So we recommend that telecommuting employees actually affirmably acknowledge that consent they are aware of and consent to all forms of electronic monitoring with respect to any communications that they make on company equipment or communications that they make on their own equipment but are for company purposes. A potential trap for the unwary is if the company is considering recording telephone conversations. We need to have an understanding of whether you're in a state that requires all parties to a recorded conversation to consent to recording or just one party. We're running short of time, so I will just quickly go through the checklist for what would be included when drafting a specific telecommuting agreement to be signed by an individual employee. As I mentioned before, our best practice recommendation is that the company have a written policy setting out general ground rules for telecommuting, and then have a specific separate agreement signed by each telecommuting worker and the company with respect to the specific telecommuting arrangements. The agreement should include duration of the arrangement. Sometimes you might have a very short telecommuting time because somebody's coming back from an illness or an injury. We usually recommend that the duration be no longer than a year, so that every year the company and the worker can, look at their relationship and decide whether it's working or whether any changes need to be made. Agreement should have a provision about terminating the arrangement, specifically recognizing that the employer or the employee has the right to terminate. But if it's terminated, how does that work? Who decides? What notice period, if any? The agreement should state the company has the right to inspect and the employee understand that. Should the job duties of the employee. If there are any changes to salary, benefits, or hours. Should have some information about the employee's expected schedule. Maybe a daily schedule. Could be a maximum number of hours permitted to work without approval. And could also indicate that the employee agrees to attend meetings in the main office as deemed necessary. Agreement should set out the method of timekeeping. Should indicate there are no representations regarding tax liabilities. And John already gave you the example of an employee who found himself in a different state from the main office and subject to much higher state taxes because his home office was in a different state. The agreement should specify the equipment, whose equipment is going to be used, to return the equipment upon termination of either the telecommuting arrangement or resignation or termination of employment. Should have some description of security obligations. In other words, that the employee understands that company property and information need to take some measures to make sure that that information is secure and the property secure. Very important that the participation in telecommuting is totally voluntary by both sides. Also very important to have a specific acknowledgement that even if there's a telecommuting arrangement for a certain time period that doesn't in effect or take or otherwise change the fact that there's employees have an employment at will status. Your agreement should reiterate that all company policies are fully applicable. Drug, alcohol, privacy, discrimination, anti-harassment, etc. policies. Should discuss if there is information that is trade secrets or is confidential or proprietary. There's an obligation of the home office worker to maintain confidentiality. A nuts and bolts item that should be included is and how expenses are to be paid. In other words, spell out if the company is going to be reimbursing the home office worker for utilities, also internet usage, phone usage, supplies, postage, etc. The agreement should have a statement that the employee understands they're obligated to maintain safe and hazard-free workplace. And I also add in here that it's important to have the reporting procedure if there is an injury under the circumstances that John went through earlier. And finally, there should be a specific written acknowledgement by the employee that they understand and agree to all of the terms of the telecommuting agreement. So that's our presentation. Looks like we're 1 minute over time. For those of you who have sent in questions, we will get back to you after the program directly with answers to your questions. Anybody who has questions after the program, please feel free to email either me or John, and we will get back to you with if you have issues or questions. Our contact information is right there on the slides. All of you will receive a recording of this webinar and all of the slides in a follow-up email. And when you log out of the program, there's a short survey. We would sure appreciate it if you have a minute and can complete that. That feedback is very helpful. Finally, a plug for the next program our firm will be putting on November 14th. At 12 p.m. Eastern, there's going to be a presentation on managing social media risks. Presentation, you're invited to attend it live in Philadelphia or by webcast. So thanks for your time, and please, if you have questions, issues, fine.
Everybody.